Greetings, I'm Ken Weinstein, Walter P. Stern Distinguished Fellow here at Hudson Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you and our distinguished panelists, whom I will introduce shortly, to our discussion on human rights promotion and the free and open Indo-Pacific. The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is central to U.S. grand strategy in Asia. It, of course, was developed by the Trump administration based off of the initial concept expressed by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in the summer of 2016, and eventually adopted and adapted by the Biden administration. It is a multi-pronged, multifaceted, whole-of-government strategy which seeks to defend national security and the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific region while seeking to promote security, economic development, regional connectivity, and good governance. Intended to challenge, on a broad level, China's hegemonic and territorial ambitions, the free and open Indo-Pacific requires the U.S. and its allies, in some sense, to balance differing conceptions of inclusivity and freedom while prioritizing competing, if not at times inconsistent, national interests in a region that varies immensely, not just geographically between continental and maritime regions, between the Pacific and Indian Ocean sides to the region, economically as well, between developed and developing nations with varying economic dependence as well on China, as well as politically, where the gamut runs from advanced democracies to authoritarian regimes. And all of this balancing in a region of immense diversity can pose challenges, of course, to America's commitment to promoting human rights. And for example, in the Biden administration, which is itself declared that it is focused on the ideological struggle between authoritarianism and democracies, itself is working closely with Vietnam and the Philippines as part of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, despite human rights concerns in both countries. How central should human rights be in the free and open Indo-Pacific? And how can human rights promotion, does it need to be balanced with U.S. and allied interests? And how can we best meet the challenge of China's growing political and economic influence, particularly in the critical non-democratic nations of the region? We have a distinguished panel today with us, at least three of whom are with us in person, one of whom is with us virtually, whom I will introduce, each of whom is a noted, not just a noted policy expert, but also a noted practitioner. I'm going to introduce our panelists in order, alphabetically by last name, and we'll begin our discussion as well that way. Marshall Billingsley is a Hudson Institute Senior Fellow. He has served in key positions at the State Department and the Defense Department here in Washington, as well as at NATO in Brussels. And for our purposes, our discussion today most notably was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing, where he was in charge of key U.S. government economic tools against money laundering and the like. Michael DeSombre is a noted international mergers and acquisitions attorney with an impressive Asia policy pedigree. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Thailand in the Trump administration, a key nation for our discussion today, given both evolutions in Thailand as well as its central role in ASEAN. And the U.S. Embassy in Thailand is one of the largest U.S. embassies in the world. Bonnie Glick, to my far left, is a former Foreign Service officer and business executive. She now heads the newly created Center for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue University. Purdue is a special place in the hearts of Hudson Institute because our former president, Mitch Daniels, now heads Purdue University. And it's an organization I think all of us will be hearing much more from in the coming months and years as tech diplomacy becomes increasingly important. Bonnie most recently served as Deputy Administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development, an agency whose mission became increasingly focused on the free and open Indo-Pacific under her tenure. Lastly, Hudson Institute Senior Fellow John Lee, who is up on the big screen for us here at Hudson and next to us on the screen for those of you watching online. John graces us from his home in Sydney, Australia. He was Senior National Security Advisor to Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop and her principal advisor on Asia, on economics, strategy, and political affairs in the Indo-Pacific region. and he played a key role in Australia's landmark 2017 foreign policy white paper, which, although it did not talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific, was very much aligned with what became U.S. strategy in the region. So let me thank each of you for taking part in the discussion, and let me just ask each of you to talk about, in your government service, respectively, how you promoted human rights, international development, governance within Asia, and particularly within the context of the free and open Indo-Pacific, as it were. Let me start with Marshall, and thank you again.
It's great to be with you and with friends and colleagues. For my part, our focus in the Treasury Department was, in this respect, implementation of the global Magnitsky sanctions program, which began under President Trump and which we used very actively to hold accountable around the world individuals engaged in gross violations of human rights and or corruption. In the Indo-Pacific region, we employed this tool in numerous cases. In fact, we had nearly 200 related sanctions on individuals and entities over the course of the Trump administration. In particular, you would have seen us in 2018 and 2019 go after a number of the key Burmese military officers who were involved in the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. We went after the leading military units and their commanders, and systematically cut them out of the international financial system. You can see, likewise, a track record under President Trump of employing this tool in the case of Cambodia, where we sanctioned the head of the Prime Minister's bodyguard unit and the unit itself for the attacks that they mounted on innocent protesters and individuals. We likewise used it in the case of one of the largest and most corrupt businessmen in Cambodia, who was engaged in illegal forestry, having bribed national park officials, and was selling this timber at cut rates to Vietnam, to China, to Russia, and to Europe. I think closer to home, we have China, who is a serial abuser of human rights. And we employed Treasury authorities to hold accountable a number of the top individuals in China involved in the detention and the forced labor of the Uyghurs, up to and including actually a Politburo member. You would have seen, and this was a little bit after my time, but the Treasury also sanctioned Carrie Lam for her role in destroying democracy in Hong Kong. And in fact, she has talked about the fact that now she can't access the banking system and has to keep her money, quote unquote, under her bed. So you can see that the sanctions are effective. But more broadly within the Treasury, not just on the sanctions portfolio, but we worked hand in glove with the Department of State, the Department of Commerce, with AID around the world to counter a number of the more repressive global activities of the Chinese. And here I'm speaking in two cases, one regarding the One Belt, One Road initiative. The Treasury, under Secretary Mnuchin, was very active in pushing debt transparency and in educating countries over the risks, the debt trap risks that China employs, where we've seen them take over ports, highways, when countries default on these loans. The other category being the technology used and employed by the Chinese to engage in systematic surveillance and repression. And here I'm speaking about companies such as Huawei, where we work together very closely to work with friendly countries around the world to understand the risk to the private information of their people if they buy and use these kinds of technologies around the world. So those are just a handful of examples of how we were very active in the Treasury Department under President Trump in promoting human rights and the rule of law through different Treasury authorities.
That's a very detailed and impressive list. Maybe I should have had you gone last. No, very impressive. We'll return to some of these, some of the decisions you made in our discussion. Let me now turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Ken. Great to be here. Great again to be accompanying friends and colleagues on this panel. This is a very important topic and very timely, obviously, as we look at how one sort of deals with the issues of promoting the free and open Indo-Pacific while also promoting human rights. It was also very relevant during my time as ambassador to Thailand. I think, firstly, the United States stands very firmly for freedom, fundamental freedoms and democracy, and we always will and we always should. But what exactly does that mean internationally, I don't think is set in stone. And I think that's a topic that's very important to discuss. I think for the intro, I'll talk about three main themes. First, I really believe that each country has a different path of democracy. And this is something that came up quite a lot when I was in Thailand when discussing what was happening in Thailand, particularly with people outside of Thailand. It is a process that countries go through. And particularly when looking at friends and allies, it's important to think about that process. I also think, as a corollary to theme number 2, is that the history of US support for pro-democracy activism in specific countries is actually not that great. There's not that many situations you can point to that because of US activism or US external pressure that has resulted in fundamental increases in democracy or increases in freedom in many, many countries. Obviously, there's a period of time not too long ago in the Arab Spring where we all were very optimistic. We were seeing the blossoming of freedom and democracy in the Middle East. I think we all know where that resulted in, and it was not the outcome that we were all hoping for. So this question of what role the U.S. should play in promoting democracy and human rights within specific countries, I think is an open question and one that we need to talk more about. The third main theme I would discuss would be that in periods of intense geostrategic competition, like the Cold War with Russia or like the current situation with China, our friends and allies of the United States have to be viewed through the lens of this geostrategic competition. That has to be relevant to the way we look at these countries. Thailand is a great example in this circumstance. After the 2014 coup, the then US administration essentially pushed Thailand away and said, we're not going to engage with you in any serious form until after you've had elections. And this went on for a long period of time. My understanding is it got to the point that almost every conversation that the US administration had was, when are the elections happening? That happened to occur at exactly the same time as China was expanding its influence into Southeast Asia and looking for more opportunities to gain traction. And so the end result of us pushing so extremely hard on the question of elections didn't result in elections happening sooner. It resulted in China having inroads into Thailand. And one of my biggest efforts when I arrived in Thailand was to re-energize the strategic relationship between the United States and Thailand because of the challenges that resulted from perhaps an overabundant pressure towards election at that time. It was the domestic activism that ultimately resulted in those countries turning the corner and really becoming democratic as they are today. And I think when you look at how much we should be pushing or supporting these domestic groups, the challenge is that when the opposition to people pushing toward freedom and democracy can say, look, these are not people actually pushing because they want to improve the country. They're pushing because they're being supported by nefarious foreign influences. That provides an opposition that can be very powerful in pushing back against the freedom and democracy that we would like to happen. And so we need to be very careful that we don't create a narrative that actually stunts the growth of freedom and democracy by pushing for it too heavily. I think I'd make closing thought that fundamentally the sustaining of the free and open Indo-Pacific in and of itself is crucial to provide a scope for countries in the Indo-Pacific to attain better freedom and democracy. With that, back to you, Ken.
Great, thank you, Michael. Very, very insightful. Bonnie, thank you.
Ken, when we first sat down to get started, you indicated that it might be hard for us to find things over which we disagree. And I think that's 100% true. I also think it would be hard for us to find things to disagree over, even if we were representatives of the current administration. Mm-hmm. So that being said, I think there's a general and very robust feeling within the United States among policymakers of the criticality of having a free and open Indo-Pacific region. When I was at USAID, we talked about something called the journey to self-reliance. The journey to self-reliance is the path that every developing country takes to reach an end state where it no longer depends on foreign assistance. And when you think about the Indo-Pacific region, you really turn to two examples of countries that have arrived at self-reliance, and they've both been mentioned here. They are Korea and Taiwan, both of whom used to receive foreign assistance from the United States and who now themselves are robust donor countries with robust democracies and freedoms and a lot of the same values that we have in the United States. So when we think about a journey to self-reliance for developing countries, we recognize that countries all take different paths, and they don't all arrive at the same place at the same time, and that they're at different stages along that journey to self-reliance. You can take the flip side of countries like Korea, which I think overall the entirety of the funding that the United States supplied to the Republic of Korea through USAID is less than Korea exports to the United States in 1 year. So when you look about it in the gross, Korea really received very little funding from the United States, and it was able to complete its journey to self-reliance relatively quickly. The flip side of that, as I said, is countries like Burma and Cambodia, which have increasingly come under the influence of the People's Republic of China and China's One Belt, One Road initiative. So when we think about development and self-reliance, China would now tout its own One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road initiative as its development program and as its development journey to help countries on. They've expanded it to include a health Belt and Road and a digital Silk Road. All of this is in stark contrast to American development. What do I mean by that? American development represents free markets and free societies. Chinese development through the One Belt, One Road initiative represents state capitalism and, as Marshall mentioned, debt trap diplomacy. And the upshot of that is that developing countries, if they adopt the Chinese model of development assistance, likely will never reach the end stage of self-reliance. Instead, they'll mortgage themselves and their country's futures to the People's Republic of China. So when it comes to human rights in the Indo-Pacific region, as Ambassador Desambre said, it is correct. There are varying interpretations of what a human rights record looks like from a Korea to a Thailand to a Burma. At the same time, there are universal values that we hold up in the United States as critical for free societies. And I think that as countries proceed along their journeys to self-reliance, they start recognizing what those universal values are. Things like freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. They don't exist in all of the countries in ASEAN or in the Indo-Pacific region, but I do believe that as countries make a concerted effort toward a model of development that is designed to land them in a self-reliant place at the end of the day, they will adopt more and more of what we view in the United States as universal values.
Thank you, Bonnie. Very helpful. Over to you, John, for an Australian perspective.
Thank you, Ken, and thanks for having me on this great panel. Well, we all know Australia is a proud liberal democracy, but many of our officials and even leaders are often reluctant to promote human rights in the region on a basis that this will offend some of our partners, such as Vietnam. And for example, during the Rodrigo Duterte period, the Philippines. We do have human rights dialogues with quite a few regional nations, but to be honest, they are very polite and non-confrontational types of conversations. Now, having said that, and when I was in government from 2016 to 18, it was pretty obvious that we couldn't vacate this space. China was moving very quickly to redefine human rights as a concept serving the interests of the regime rather than the individual. And if we vacated this space, it would obviously would be filled up very quickly by those sorts of authoritarian voices. Working within those parameters, one thing I tried to get our political leaders and officials to do was to focus on funding and promoting the types of institutions that advance human rights, even if we never spoke about human rights directly. So here I'm speaking about the right of judicial independence, which is actually written into the constitution of many countries, the right for media to operate independently, which is the official policy of many countries, the right for civil groups to form and gather without being harassed. And we should remember that a lot of authoritarian standards and mindsets are derived from the way economic and commercial transactions are conducted. So in particular, China relies heavily on using material largesse to achieve elite capture, not just to gain economically, but to spread its own political and authoritarian moral standards throughout the region. And as we know, this is very much about what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. From this perspective, arguing against some of my colleagues inside the system, I argued very strongly for us not to join the BRI. There was quite a lot of pressure at the time from China and within our system to join the BRI. And fortunately, that was something that we walked away from. I also worked with others in our system to ensure that our development assistance or aid objectives and conditions put a high emphasis on supporting liberal institutions. This was especially important in the Pacific Island nations and with long-standing partners such as the Philippines, which at the time was experiencing a significant human rights backsliding during my time in government. Finally, just to end with a couple of key challenges, we have to remember that amongst the 30 or so countries in the Indo-Pacific, all about around half a dozen of these are fully industrialized economies. The rest are low or medium income countries seeking rapid economic development as the highest priority. Now, China has been extremely successful in spreading these two narratives. One, human rights is irrelevant to rapid development for low income countries. And two, even more than this, authoritarian approaches that downplay the importance of the individual are superior when it comes to achieving rapid development. Until we can test these two narratives and revise them, human rights will be seen by many in the region as an extravagant preoccupation of rich nations. And this is certainly something I think we need to confront directly. Thanks, Ken.
Great. Look, thank you, John. And there have been four superb presentations, lots of questions to be arise, certainly out of the discussions. There seems to be a general consensus that direct democracy promotion can be counterproductive in some ways. At least from, I think, three of you. Marshall didn't quite touch on this subject.
Yeah, I may be the outlier in this discussion.
And so, why are you the outlier then?
Look,
The disagreement noted.
I generally agree with the tenor of the comments made, but John and I may be a little closer from what I've just heard. I believe that the principles of democracy and human rights and anti-corruption, these are core values of the United States that underpin and should underpin the way we engage with the rest of the world. And we've been doing so since we established these principles in a revolution. I have seen firsthand, actually not within the Treasury, but certainly within arguments within the Department of State, this clash, this tension between the conduct of, or the promotion of democracy and human rights that potentially could come at the expense of other equities and national security imperatives. I tend to fall on the side of pushing the human rights agenda, even if we understand that we take a calculated risk in other parts of these relationships. It certainly gets very, very complicated very, very quickly depending upon what kinds of actions we take. But when I talk about these different Treasury authorities we employed, I think it's important that we hold individuals accountable for their actions, that there are consequences to human rights abuse, and those consequences include the fact that you will not participate in the formal financial system globally if you engage in these. There's a deterrent effect that this also has on would-be abusers if they understand that we are watching and that we are prepared to take action. It has to be nuanced, I agree. We can talk more about that, but as you can kind of tell from my comments, I tend to be a little more on the aggressive side of promoting human rights with real material consequences to those who abuse them.
But it's interesting because the places where we impose the Magnitsky sanctions, in most cases, were not friends and allies of the United States. And I think that actually leads to the subtlety and the different aspects of how to deal with this. And when I was in Thailand, there obviously were issues that we had with things that were going on and concerns. But I always made it clear that I would raise those privately with the leaders. I was not out there to be publicly standing on a soapbox and sort of berating people, because I generally find that not to be very productive, particularly in Asia, where people care more how they're perceived in some circumstances. Not that other people around the world don't, but I mean, there's perhaps a little bit more of it. And so I think that's sort of the interesting spectrum, is to sort of how we treat these different countries and how we're promoting human rights and democracy varies along a spectrum as to how much they are a friend and ally versus a competitor to some degree as well.
And I think there's also, sorry, John, just real quick. I think there's also this spectrum of human rights and human rights abuses. And there's almost a scale that you have to measure different situations against. And so you have at the top of the scale as the absolute worst, you have genocide. So you have the Uyghurs and other populations in China that are being systematically destroyed. And you have the same situation with the Rohingya in Burma. That's as bad as it gets. And there are these legal definitions within the Justice Department of gradations of violation of human rights. So I think when you measure against those, you run up against things like human trafficking. That's right up there in the horrible human rights abuses category. But when you don't have free elections, for example, in a country like Vietnam, which is on a very different path than the United States when it comes to democracy. It's one party, it's the Communist Party, but it provides for the population of Vietnam, and these horrible high-level abuses you don't see happening as regularly, or in the case of genocide, if at all. So there is that spectrum. I think it does all go into a balance, as Michael said, based on who are our friends and allies, and it's a very uncomfortable place to be, where you have to sit in judgment and make a determination of which kind of human rights abuse is worse. The useful thing is that there are these gradations, but at the same time, all of it is intolerable. Recognizing that the United States also is an experiment in democracy, and we're still working toward that more perfect union, as is Australia. We're almost like outliers out there. Human nature notwithstanding, I think it's incumbent on us as a country, as democracies, to promote as much as we can for positive human rights, but understanding too that there are some, as with GLOMAG, you just have to put your foot down and say unacceptable.
John.
I think Michael touched on this in his comments, particularly about Thailand. And one of the challenges we face is that if you look at the first 30, 40 years after World War II in the region, the American market was really the primary market. That was the big thing that every country wanted access to. There were no alternatives. Now, of course, countries now have an alternative to some degree. And the example of Thailand is a very important one, because when the Obama administration disengaged with Thailand looked immediately to China. And that is always now the dynamics, I think, that we sort of have to, or the reality that we need to deal with in our region. What I would say about democracy and human rights and so on as well in our region is that, I think being more precise about definitions matters. So democracy is giving a person a vote in the determination of their government. But in my view, if you don't build those institutions that I'm talking about, rule of law, independent judiciary, property rights, those sorts of things, if you just have elections but very poor institutions, you often actually lead to even worse outcomes than if you didn't have that election. So this is why, from my point of view, certainly, democracy is important, but you have to build those institutions for that nation to eventually get to a better place and not have to look at an alternative like Chinese suggests that's out there for every nation that wants it.
Let me ask, how do you balance, or do you need to balance U.S. strategic interest when we're, which Michael talked about this a bit, or implied it, when you're looking at these decisions as to what kinds of actions to take? Do you think there's a need to balance? How much of a balance do you need to do when looking at our interests? And obviously, Vietnam is the perfect example because it's geographically critical to the free and open Indo-Pacific. It is critical to because of its long-standing animus towards China, its growing cooperation with us on the security side, with the other nations with whom we're most closely allied.
Well, I think, Bonnie, you put it very aptly in a couple of ways. One is that these countries are all on their own journey, taking different paths, and that we do need to have an understanding of gradations of what is tolerable versus what is unacceptable. So I think inherent in that logic is a balancing act. That said, we have to make clear what is intolerable, and other nations need to understand that. I think under the Trump administration, it was crystal clear. You don't take Americans hostage. You don't engage in these genocidal activities, or there will be real material consequences to the policymakers and the actors who engage in this. Not just in the Indo-Pacific, but in Nicaragua and Venezuela, across the world. And one of the things I also probably should have mentioned is that in addition to all those discrete actions I took, we took a lot of non-sanctions related efforts to promote, for instance, CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., type processes in various countries so that they could adopt a much more collective decision-making process when it came to Chinese investment, for instance, or any foreign investment for that matter. We likewise pushed countries across the Indo-Pacific to adopt global Magnitsky type authorities, something that I'm very pleased now that the European Union has at least adopted the human rights aspect of that, not yet the corruption aspect. So it is a capacity building, not just internally within the country, but capacity building with our friends and partners to, like us, hold others accountable for their behaviors, and the Chinese in particular.
And the Japanese certainly are now moving on their own global Magnitsky and are quite aligned. They're obviously the Canadians have, and they're
right. Canada was a great partner, for instance, on Venezuela.
Mm-hmm. I think, Ken, in response to your question, I sort of go back to my last comment, is that the sustaining a free and open Indo-Pacific is what will allow the countries in the Indo-Pacific to have the scope for developing democracy and fundamental freedoms to the extent they don't have them there. Were we not able to maintain that, were we to have a hegemonic situation in Asia, I think things would be much different for many of these countries. So that inherently does provide some idea of balancing. We need to make sure we keep that platform there, and then we can try to promote within that platform. But if we don't keep that platform there, we'll be lost. But I really like what John and also Bonnie said about the institutions and the economic aspects, because I think this is something I also spent a lot of time in Thailand focusing on, was the greater economic integration and economic development and just the free market system that exists in the various Asian countries, or any country really, the better platform for democracy and fundamental freedoms. I think there's actually a lot more connection between economic development that USAID helped promote and getting to sort of that fundamental freedoms as well, because the basic capitalist system depends upon individual freedoms to be able to decide, what they do, where they buy and sell, how they interact. And then also having the institutions, as John said, is one way that we also can promote the democracy and fundamental freedoms without banging people over the head with it. We try to give them training in judicial independence and media independence and things like that a lot of these countries really want to know more about. So, I mean, there's opportunities for us to do that in a way that helps promote the institutions without necessarily sort of banging people over the head where we're trying to get to.
And I think that, in general, is the role that USAID has traditionally played in that capacity building in countries, in training, in fostering as John said, the institution building and the understanding of the role that institutions play in countries, the rule of law as a basic foundation for societal advancement. And to that end, in the Indo-Pacific region, I think there's been tremendous progress, even in certain countries where it's harder, like in a Cambodia, at least, or in a Laos, or the lower income countries, as well as in countries like the Philippines, where there's a fundamental understanding that it is good to have these institutions for your citizens. They have not yet adopted all of them. You have massive countries like Indonesia, huge democracy, and that's an extraordinary palette of diverse institutions and diverse capabilities. Part of what an agency like USAID, in collaboration with the rest of the whole of government, that's what the Free and Open Indo-Pacific is about. It's every single part of US government focused in this direction, and working jointly as well, significantly with our Quad partners. This is how we get to the point of having more Indonesias and fewer Burmas.
Sure, and under your tenure at USAID, the trilateral cooperation with Australia and the Japanese became a big focus of an awful lot, from regional connectivity to energy security and beyond, particularly for Southeast Asia, and also for the Pacific Island nations as well. John?
I mean, I would say that certainly Australia learned a lot from the low period of relations with Thailand. So you take Philippines, for example, when Duterte came to power, and he went on this brutal anti-drug campaign policy, and secondly, he had, as we know, Duterte is a visceral anti-American president. But what we did, and what the Americans did, I think, pretty well, was we sort of realized that we couldn't change the nature of the leader, but we focused on the ministers and institutions beneath the president. So we being Australia, America, allies, we had excellent relationships with the foreign and defense ministers. We had excellent relationships with the military, which we leveraged. We focused on counterinsurgency, which is something that Philippines needed at the time. And we built those sort of lower level institutional and personal connections, such that I actually think, after the Duterte period, which will end shortly, we're still in a pretty good position with a country like that. So I think we have learned from some of our common mistakes in the past in just completely disengaging. But we certainly do need a country strategy or different country strategies. Vietnam, for example, if you went on about democracy, one person, one vote, you wouldn't get very far. But if you go on about institutions, I think you'll get further.
No, very interesting. Let's turn to two specific countries that are complex and important in their own ways. Let's first look at the example of Burma, which you mentioned, Marshall. You mentioned the sanctions earlier. How do you balance running the risk of speaking out as we should on human rights in Burma, particularly as was mentioned about the case of the Rohingya on the one hand. On the other hand, how do we do this without pushing Burma firmly into the hands of China and then risk having security challenges in Thailand and other region and other neighbors? Is that something we need to balance? How do you go about doing that?
Well, I mean, Burma's I think Burma under the military junta is firmly in the grip of the communist Chinese. So there's not much risk of that happening. It's already happened. One of the things that I've noticed is the frequency with which the Department of State, the spokesman under the Biden administration, issues these press statements where they condemn this or they're greatly concerned about that. Almost every day, these words concerned, greatly concerned, deeply concerned. And yet, talk is cheap. These concerns need to be followed up with concrete material actions. What those actions are should be case dependent. And as Bonnie has said repeatedly, this whole of government concept, the tools that we use at the Treasury, if those are the only tools that are employed, they will not be effective. They need to be part of a broader political, diplomatic, military strategy, informational strategy that we employ on a case-by-case basis, and with this broader set of national security objectives that we have for the region. I mean, China is a country that has attacked nearly all of its neighbors at one point or another in its history, including the Soviets. Has territorial disputes all over the region. Now, in the case of Burma, and I'll just be very brief on this, when you employ the kind of, when you promote democracy and human rights using economic pressure as a tool, we do run into some pretty complex situations very quickly. In some cases, in my view, it's pretty cut and dried. Slave labor with the Uyghurs, unacceptable. And US companies should not profit from the fruit of this kind of horrific behavior. There are other cases that get far more complicated that I dealt with, whether we're talking about what to do with DirecTV in Venezuela, actually supporting the flow of information into the country, actually at an economic loss. But there we also ran into the challenges with the oil and gas sector, and the same is now true in the case of Burma. If you force US companies to cut and run, where does this fall in the spectrum of handing lock, stock, and barrel over to the Chinese or the Russians, regimes that don't prioritize human rights, and at the same time potentially causing a major downspike in revenue that will affect the humanitarian situation? So it is a balancing act, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. But I think we need to be prepared in those cases where you're at the higher end of that spectrum of gradation. And I put Burma pretty high on that spectrum, to be honest, that you need to be prepared as the free world's leader in democracy and human rights. You need to be prepared to absorb some economic consequences for standing up for what you believe is right.
This has been an extraordinarily rich and informative conversation. I just want to thank each of you and also our public affairs team for helping pull the event together. Thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to continuing the conversation as regional developments warrant. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, Ken.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.